this week, I think we see a common thread. How God communicates with people in the story and kind of what does that mean? What does it say? All the various ways, right? So one of the main ways God communicates is through these prophets, right? Misbehaving men of God. They're not always men. It just happens the main characters in our story have been male prophets, but Bible's got female prophets as well. But these guys are, they're misbehaving. Ahab doesn't want to hear from Elijah. He doesn't want to see Elijah show up, or Nathan, or Micaiah. Later we say he doesn't want anything. These guys are trouble, right? Because they always say things that Ahab or the other, wayward kings don't want to hear. Take a look at this map with that in mind, okay? Do you see something here? If you take away the 2 times where Elijah is in the territory of Judah, because he's literally on the run from Ahab, from King Ahab, if you take those out, all right, let's just move here. Do you notice a trend about the activity of these men, Elijah and Elisha? This is, again, not a trick question. As I say hi to people joining, we got Terry with us. We got Sarah as well. Welcome in, you too. Hi, Terry. Talking about this idea of how God communicates with the people in the story this week. That's what we're talking about here. And then the idea of, hey, do we ever find ourselves wanting to hear from God too? And what kind of things do we want God to say to us, right? That's our conversation. Here's what I'm seeing as commonality. All right? Every one of these, you got 2 things. You got a couple of outliers. Elisha ends up one time in Damascus, out of Israel's territory. Elijah ended up one time in Phoenicia, here at Zarephath, outside of Israel's territory. But every other incident from these 2 pretty wild and awesome prophets are happening inside the borders of Israel. So we can get something from this, I think, about why God is sending prophets. One of the ways that God is communicating in our story, right? If we go back to this, how do we see God communicating with people this week? Well, prophets are one of them. And there's something about the fact that Judah doesn't need Elijah and Elisha, because at that time they have kings who are listening to what God has already said to them. And by that, we mean in this point in the story, we've got the law of Moses. God told the kings, listen, learn, follow my instructions, right? That's what kings are supposed to do. Now, and so the kings of Judah in this time and place, Judah has kings like Jehoshaphat, not perfect, but they're listening and they're following God's instructions. So they don't need to have prophets come by and slap and, kind of slap around a little bit. Do you follow? Meanwhile, Ahab and Omri and the rest in this era, they need a lot of course correction from God. Does that make sense? So I think that's just interesting. You look at the map, look for patterns in the story. It's not accidental. I think we look at prophets and we go, man, which I agree, man, Elijah is amazing to me. In fact, he comes up, he's a one of these figures from the Old Testament that you're going to want to pay attention to, because he's going to come up often in our story. He's going to be referred to later in the Old Testament, later in the New Testament, all the way including Jesus in the Gospels and the final book in our Bibles, the book of Revelation. All right? So pay attention to these guys. They're great. But here's the thing. Prophets only are necessary when people aren't listening to what God has already told them. Does that make sense? So it's kind of like it's as Ahab, calls Elijah, I believe. Yeah. He calls him, what do you want, you troublemaker, you troubler of Israel? It's like, well, Yeah, I mean, Elijah kind of does cause some problems, but it's not because he's a troublemaker. It's because Ahab's making trouble, and Elijah is here to offer some course correction. Prophets they come up all the time in the Bible story, and we admire them. But fact is, the times when we need them to show up in the story are dark times. In fact, and if you are, a lot of you guys are familiar with the Bible story in some way, we're going to see prophets at some point. Prophets give us more content and move the story forward when kings of Israel and Judah drop out of the story. There's going to be a time in our story where we're not going to have any more kings of Judah or kings of Israel, but we're still going to have prophets. And the reason is, as God's people drift further and further away from following God's instructions, they need to hear from God in ways they can't ignore. It's a kindness from God. It's I don't know, call it grace, but it's not pleasant at the same time, right? You don't want Elijah coming in and, predicting drought and, chopping up your prophets of Baal, these things, right? You don't want that, but you need it. From God's point of view, you need it, right? That's the purpose of the prophets.